EDHREC is a site built entirely around statistics to make up our format, but sometimes those statistics might not represent what cards work best in a deck. Welcome to Challenge the Stats, where I'm going to take a look at 2 cards that could be used for a popular commander. One that I think sees too much play, and one that I think sees too little. Korvold, the Fae-Cursed King, is the most popular Jund commander on EDHREC, and it's the 12th most popular commander overall. People just love the card that originated in the Brawl decks. Korvold is 5 mana, 2 in Jund for a legendary creature Dragon Noble. It's a 4/4 with flying. Whenever Korvold Fae-Cursed King enters the battlefield or attacks, sacrifice another permanent. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1 counter on Korvold and draw a card. And that is not capped to once per turn. This card is ridiculously powerful, doing all of the things right there on one body. The card I'd like to investigate for Korvold is Reliquary Tower, which currently shows up in 39% of Korvold decks. Reliquary Tower is a simple land that says you have no maximum hand size, so you can hold on to all the cards you draw, and Korvold draws a lot of cards. Now, I'm not going to argue Reliquary Tower is a bad card. I'm a fan of it personally. I like it as kind of a safety blanket, but I understand the logic that says you maybe don't necessarily need to run it. The best 7 cards should be good enough. I don't think it's a bad card by any stretch of the imagination, though. However, the problem here is that Reliquary Tower can sometimes cause conflict with other cards that Korvold players occasionally use. Victimize shows up in like 35% of Korvold decks. Reanimate appears in like 27% of Korvold decks. Animate Dead is in 18%. If you're playing reanimation spells in Korvold to get back your cool creatures, it's important to not run a card like Reliquary Tower that passively prevents you from discarding the hand size. Having a limit of 7 cards can actually help Korvold players toss stuff like Zeotora and Old Gnawbones into the graveyard and get them back very, very cheaply. It's interesting to compare Reliquary Tower to Thought Vessel too, which only shows up in 10% of Korvold decks. If an infinite hand size was super critical to the strategy, you'd think that Thought Vessel's inclusion rates would be closer to Reliquary Tower's inclusion rates. I think if you're playing around with Graveyard Recursion in your Korvold deck, then Reliquary Tower fights against you a little bit. And vice versa, if you really like Reliquary Tower, it might be worth taking more of a critical look at how often you can enable your own reanimation spells, and if you're playing one of those effects and the other feels overplayed to me. But you know what card isn't overplayed? Jade Orb of Dragonkind. Jade Orb of Dragonkind is 2 and a green for an artifact, tap it to add a green to your mana pool, and when you spend this mana to cast a dragon creature spell, it enters the battlefield with an additional +1 counter on it, and gains Hexproof till your next turn. It's in just 38 of over 12,000 Korvold decks in EDHREC, and that is way too few. It's an absurdly good fit for Korvold decks. First, it puts a +1 counter on the Fae-Cursed King right upon casting. What's most important, though, is the fact that Jade Orb gives Hexproof for a full trip around the board right away. Korvold is a huge removal target, and this means you don't need to worry about leaving mana up for the first time you cast him to equip Swiftfoot Boots or to keep a green free so you can have a Tameo Safekeeping or something ready to keep your commander safe. And it's not just your commander. Prosh, Skyraider of Care, Ancient Copper Dragon, Old Gnawbones, and Zeotor the Incinerator are all dragons, and all are in the top 20 most popular creatures in Korvold decks. So it keeps your commander safe, and it keeps other things safe for a trip around the board as well. And yes, it costs 3 mana, and that isn't necessarily ideal, but spending 1 more mana to add a counter and keep your commander safe for a full turn absolutely feels worth 1 extra pip over something like Thalwar Stone. So in summary, Jade Orb of Dragonkind, underplayed in Korvold, and Reliquary Tower, overplayed in Korvold. Thanks for listening, and remember to EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.